Welcome to Coffee with Kusari. I'm Ben Cotton, and this time I'm joined by Brian Exelbierd. He's a product manager at Microsoft, and he's here to talk to us about some non-work research he's done recently. So, welcome, Brian.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So, you recently had a couple of really interesting blog posts analyzing LLM-driven reviews of Linux kernel patches. Can you describe quickly for the audience, what you looked at and what you found?
So I had seen an article in LWN by Derek Alden about the use of an LLM to do patch review for the Linux kernel memory management sub, whatever they call those things in the kernel. I am not a kernel person. I don't do kernel work for Microsoft. As far as I know, Microsoft's not involved in Sashiko. This was purely of self-interest to me. What caught my eye about it was the use of LLMs to look at code and what they find. And part of that was driven by my own personal interests in LLM code and having other LLMs look at code other LLMs wrote. But going back to the kernel, the folks on this list were debating whether Sashiko's LLM reviews should be a mandatory element of the Linux kernel memory management group's work. And the primary maintainer was saying yes, that they wanted all these reviews to be answered and to be dealt with. And other people were coming back with a lot of comments about, one, the false positive rate, and then two, about just the general burden of dealing with LLM-driven reviews. Some of the framing was along the lines of LLMs can infinitely derive new review content, but humans have finite levels of capacity.
So you tested a couple of hypotheses. The first one was that the same pre-existing bugs would just surface repeatedly, but you found that was untrue.
Yeah, so I was kind of curious if what we were seeing in part was that there was just a huge volume of content. And so let's say there was some existing problem, and then every review was getting clipped with it. And so even if there was a patch in progress to fix that, every reviewer would, in theory, have to pause and go, okay, wait, is this being fixed? Is this not being fixed? And those pieces would continue to be problematic and create effort. I did a very basic textual analysis, and there was very little similarity between the reports. So it doesn't seem like there's any likelihood that, at least for this particular module, that anything is being surfaced repeatedly over and over again. The only clear incidence of it that I found was from the same person basically resubmitting the same patch.
Yeah, and I think that's, a good result that, you want to see if you're adopting a tool like this, right? You want the low noise and you don't want to be pestered about the things you're already working on. The other hypothesis you looked at, I thought, was really a lot more interesting, and it had, maybe some more thought-provoking results. Your thought was that reviewers are getting told about bugs that they didn't create. And you concluded that it's partially supported, but the story is in the distribution. So what do you mean by that?
Well, the other way that I was looking at it was, if I'm a submitter of code and you come back to me and you tell me what's wrong with my code, whether I agree or disagree or anything else, it's at least about what I did. But the Sashiko LLM has been directed to consider the code around the contribution, digging back into subsystems that are called, looking at other related pieces. And so it in theory is surfacing things that the contributor didn't actually do. Some of these things are trivial, like, hey, while I was looking around, I found this comment that has a typo in it. And some of them were, it sounds like, fairly substantial bugs. And I was curious if that was creating weight on the process. And what I found was that the vast majority of reviews do not seem to have this kind of bug surfacing, this kind of commentary surfacing. And I used linguistic phrase matching. So it wasn't an LLM doing inferencing over it. It was key phrases the LLM likely output when it found these kinds of bugs. And so about 80% of reviews didn't have that signal. But the other 20%, it tended to be fairly heavy. It went from 30% roughly on average, but it ranged pretty wide, if I recall correctly. And what that was telling me was that if you think about it right, roulette, when your number comes up, you suddenly got a swamp of things that have come at you that you didn't do, some of which will be trivial, fix the typo, and some of which will not be.
So, I think everyone would agree that we want to fix bugs and fixing bugs is good. At the same time, like I do understand the look, I didn't do this. Why do I need to fix it in order to get my work accepted? How do we balance that, burden, these two competing interests of yes, let's fix bugs, let's make things more secure, versus like let's not ask the one person who happened to stand near the hornet's nest to clear it out.
I think that's the key here. The maintainer is continually making a point about not shipping bugs being the number one priority. And therefore, from their perspective, any bug found is a bug that needs to be fixed. And I think that what contributors are pushing back on, and the kernel's an interesting structure because there's like layers of maintainers. But if you think about a simpler open source project, you have a core group of maintainers and you have a group of contributors. And kind of the tension here is that as a maintainer, when you accept a contribution, you're inherently saying yes to the code today and to all of the maintenance work that will ever be required on that code. Because that original contributor may no longer be present in the project when and if an issue comes up. And new contributors may or may not show up to fix legacy code. What I think is going on here is that you're seeing this requirement on maintainers pushed down to all contributors. And so everybody who contributes is suddenly on the hook for doing a level of maintenance in the project. And that may or may not be real. Your contributor may not have any expertise outside of the narrow patch that they've written. Especially when you start talking about something that's commercially supported like the Linux kernel, it may be the case that the contributor can't or shouldn't touch code that they're not contributing. There's a lot of pieces there, and that's where I think maintainers need to think through, what does this mean? Should I be opening issues on these bugs and letting them just be known issues? Or should I really be trying to enforce a social standard in my project?
Yeah, and that leads me into I think my favorite two sentences in the posts that you wrote, and I think it really applies, in all domains of technology. You said the sharpest question the data raise isn't statistical; it's social. Um, you know, every technology problem is a social problem underneath, right? So, what should community leaders be doing to address these issues in their own open source communities or within companies?
Well, the first thing that I would suggest is that you, as a maintainer, set a clear policy on what your expectations for contributions are. Like I was raised with the philosophy that you should always leave a place better than you found it. So, like if you go to the park and you're cleaning up after your picnic, you pick up the little bits of trash that were already there. If that's what your project's going to be like, make sure that contributors understand that. There have been projects in the past that have had things like they wouldn't accept a new maintainer who worked for a company until that maintainer had done work that wasn't in that company's direct interest. And the idea was, basically prove you're going to clean up the whole park, not just the little bit you care about. On the other hand, as a maintainer, it's your job to shape the project. And it may be the case that you need to use the idiom, to call balls and strikes on the kinds of things that are being found and say, yes, this is a real bug, but it's not in the use case we're targeting. So we're not going to fix it. Or at least we're not going to prioritize the contributors, or I am going to go in and do this work. If somebody shows up with a patch, I'll consider it. When you get into commercialized open source, I think it becomes a little more interesting. I would argue, and I'm sure that there's counter examples here, that most companies that commercialize open source have a larger than maintainer responsibility. You are deliberately using an open source development model and then deriving a product from it. And people are going to argue that the open source needs to be fit for a lot more purposes than just your commercial purpose. And so I would say that you need to do almost a CVE-like severity conversation around these bugs and decide, are they really worth fixing or not, and why? And what is the risk to a consumer of the open source project who's not your commercial customer?
So, what about from the perspective of people developing these sorts of tools? I think you have a lot of experience in open source communities and you have a lot of experience using LLMs in various contexts. What's sort of the ideal the tool look like for you?
From my perspective, when I'm building, if I were to build a tool like this, what I would be looking for is a clean way to separate this commentary. One of the things that I saw in the Linux kernel conversation, as reported in the article, was that it's a mixed bag that you get back. One of the pieces of analysis that I did was what is the average number of lines that are added to the maintainer's response email for each type of bug? Because I'm literally just putting volume in front of a human. And if it's all interleaved and mixed, then that human has no choice but to slog through the whole thing. Whereas I think that if a tool like this could learn to not only identify these kinds of issues that aren't related to the direct contribution, which I consider the most important finding here, um, and then either segregate those off or perhaps have a way to surface those that doesn't involve that human having to read it right now. That would be one consideration. On the other side, I think that it's important that you continually retrain your tool. You should make sure that the tool is understanding what represents a real problem in this project. And that's going to mean codifying your standards, codifying your expectations, and codifying where the project really sits in the continuum of everything must be perfect to YOLO.
I will point out for our viewers here that Kusari Inspector does, really take into account what is the scope of the change and not try to introduce a bunch of ancillary findings. So we've talked a lot about the interpersonal dynamics and the scope of a review, but one thing we haven't talked a lot about yet is false positives. And like obviously, um, false positives are very frustrating because it represents meaningless work essentially that a reviewer has to do or a contributor has to try and address or triage to say no, this isn't actually a problem. So did you find anything with false positives, or do you have some general thoughts on that matter?
So I thought about false positives. It's a large part of the narrative, as you'll see that you would see in the LWN article as well. And I tried to attack this from two perspectives. I immediately dismissed trying to analyze for false positives in any real sense of the word. I don't have the domain depth required to tell you if a particular comment was a false positive or not. That requires somebody who's deep in this particular part of the kernel. What I instead thought was, well, maybe a false positive is any kind of a code review that doesn't result in a code change, with the idea being that that means that whatever was found in the review was incorrect. But that's not completely true, because Ben, if you review my code and you say, hey, what about this? And we wind up having a long conversation. One of us will come out of that conversation changed, likely both of us. One, we may just genuinely hit upon a better solution related to pieces, each of us brought to the table that the other isn't aware of. But the other is that we may be more sure about a patch at the end of that conversation, or happier with the way that something is going. If I have that same conversation, if you will, with an LLM agent, no one comes out of this conversation changed in a positive way, because the LLM is not going to materially do anything with what I said. There's no effort here except for me arguing with a machine.
Thanks for joining us, Brian, and we'll see you all next time on Coffee with Kusari.